Welcome everybody to another Thursday with Third Path webinar. As usual, I'm super excited about today's guest, Kyra Cavanaugh. I've actually known her and her business partner for a very long time, pretty much since the founding of Third Path, I'd guess. And they are very exceptional people. I've known that since the first time I met them. And they run a consulting firm that I think really has a very high bar on these issues of really helping teams and leaders and organizations think in a very progressive way around what our workplaces can really look like. So, how can we really do flex in a way where flex doesn't mean we're working all day, then working in the evenings and on the weekends and on vacations? And what you'll see in today's call at the root of this is really thinking about capacity. How much work can we do as a person, as a team, as an organization? And I think what will come out in today's call is that this is a complex issue. One simple way to prove it's a complex issue is even at Third Path, where we are, I think, experts around these issues. I personally have struggled with this issue so many times. Luckily, I've learned something every single time too. So welcome, Kyra. I'm really excited to have you. I want to hear more about Life Meets Work, and I'm really excited to talk about capacity management. It's really at the root of work-life integration. If we're trying to live a life where we have time for other things, our families, our relationships, our communities, to travel, see the world, go back to school, phase into retirement, all those things we want to do in an integrated way, at the core is being able to have, quote unquote, the right amount of work so we have time and energy for our lives. So thanks for being here to talk about that. What do you have to say? We'd love to hear a little bit about Life Meets Work. Anything else, Kyra? We're so glad you're here.
Thanks so much, Jessica. And the feeling is definitely mutual. I have admired the work and that you do with all of the people you're doing it with. That's two prepositions in one sentence. So not a cold as an excuse. I don't necessarily do, maybe a few nerves. Anyway, I'm really happy to be with all of you. I started Life Meets Work behind the scenes about 11 years ago. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary. And the reason I got into it was because of my own struggles with wanting to be amazing at work and amazing outside of work and just not really seeing how that was possible. I tried working pretty much every kind of flex arrangement available to me at the time, and even ones I sort of advanced in organizations where there weren't any, and even got to the point of thinking about ducking out of the food industry I've been in for 20 years and starting a home-based, sort of home party business. And then a coconut hit me on the head, and I thought, I really want to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out how to unlock happiness and well-being, high-quality relationships for not only me, but for everyone in the workforce. Our mission is helping every working person live a better life. And we've approached it from a number of different perspectives. And work load has been, and capacity has been at the core of what we've been thinking about from the very beginning. We started as a flex consultancy specifically, and as you know, we always sort of struggled with organizations who thought they could do it themselves or who were already on the board in terms of doing flexibility. Even if the integrity behind the scenes of everyone feeling really comfortable and able to work flexibly wasn't necessarily there, we really wanted to shore that up. And so I wrote a book called Who Works Where and Who Cares to really help managers and teams and individuals think about how we can be focused on helping each other live the life that we want to, both in and outside of work. And so as Jessica just changed the slide, there are really 6 places that we focused on in the book. Performance, sort of answering the question of how do I know if you're working, how do I know if you're working when we aren't all in the same place at the same time. Looking at capacity and resilience, which is really around burnout, engagement, as it pertains to the amount of work we're all trying to get done, both in our home lives and at work. Really, tool 3 is about flexibility, and how do you really live as an organization your commitment to flexibility, not just for people you trust, not just for high performers, but across the organization. We also looked at this idea of work process. Sometimes we haven't, in organizations, really rethought how can we be more efficient? What reports are we still chained to doing on a monthly basis that no one actually ever reads? And are we courageous enough to, sort of raise our hand and say, I think there's a better way? Tools 5 and 6 are really around how do we stay connected? How do we build that sense of belonging? How do we communicate? And that becomes even more important in the kind of D&I context that we've been seeing, not only in the sexual harassment and assault kinds of issues that are at the forefront of our society right now, but also in terms of that sense of covering the issues in D&I around, can I be transparent about who I am, what I value, and how I work, so that we can all be having the kinds of conversations that really matter. So more recently, we've been not only looking at structural kinds of issues and helping teams and leaders get their arms around this, but also helping individuals from the perspective of offering coaching as a benefit internally for organizations to help individuals figure out how to do this better. And then also looking at this more and more through the lens of well-being and thinking about flexibility, work life in the context of being healthy and being happy and being able to do this for a long time. So we'll talk more about the workload piece, but there's certainly plenty of things that I'm happy to talk about either on this call today if you have questions or outside of that. And I would be remiss, Jessica, if I didn't mention I am the parent of 3 kids, ages 22, 16, and about to be 14, and wanting to make sure that I'm still being present as they move into the much more complex aspects of teenage and young adulthood. So yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, really great. And no surprise that you've expanded or linked it to well-being, because that's some of the funnest parts of my job. Is I feel like, again, all of these tools are super important, but that's the beauty of capacity management. It's really about well-being, and that there's this incredible positive cycle that happens. It doesn't mean we hit it every single day, every single month, but when you are more in line with having the right amount of work for the people you have available, and you've made those tough decisions, people feel happier and more engaged and more energized and more creative, and there's just all kinds of positive things that happen. And the opposite is so true, and we'll be talking about that today, that when people are chronically overworked as individuals or teams or organizations, there's just so many bad things that happen. So that's, again, why capacity management is good, because, yes, it lets us live integrated lives, but it turns out it helps us work smarter when we are working, in general, doing the right amount of work. So that's what you'll be hearing about today, is kind of this idea about how do you do capacity management? How can we more often, as people, teams, and organizations, feel like we've got the right amount of work to do for the time we have available for work? So with that in mind, I have a little picture I've been using this year to talk about this. And the idea is that we are all trying to balance work and other life responsibilities. And the thing that I think is getting shortchanged is recharge time. So if you look at this group of batteries, which either represent a person who's coming into the workplace or a person who's part of a family system who's coming into the workplace, they're coming in too often, I think, with not enough recharge time, where they weren't able to really fully turn off work over the weekend, or fully turn off work on vacation, or even, fully turn off work in the evening. Although I do know that, sometimes there's going to be these episodic periods of overwork when we have to have work spill in. But if it's constant, what happens is we lose that recharge time. And that's where I think you get burnout, lack of engagement, lack of creativity. There's lots more I could say about this battery picture, but the big message is the more we get smart around setting boundaries, how much we can really handle, both on the work side and on the life side, the smarter we get around how to get our work done and how to feel like we are more enthusiastic about both work and life. Kyra, does this ring any bells when you see this little batteries picture?
Yeah, and actually, I think it's really important as we enter into this dialogue to think and for me to be speaking from a place of integrity. It's really easy for us to theorize that this is how we need to be living our lives. It's really important that we are spending time fantasizing and dreaming and thinking about with ourselves and our loved ones how we might reorganize our lives to be able to do this. And the reality is that it is extremely difficult for most of us to be able to parent or not, working in a large organization or a small one or on our own. It's very hard for us to think in terms of being, not just doing, and prioritizing that being time, that recharging time, even remembering what we care about, what helps us to renew beyond a glass of wine in the evening. It becomes really important for us to recognize this isn't easy, and we all know that we need to be doing this. The devil's in the details. The challenge is really how do we organize ourselves as individuals and the systems at work so that we actually can live this. And a real quick story, I am a workaholic, and I'm a recovering workaholic, but I've been a workaholic my whole life. And so it's not like I've sat under a tree my whole life and contemplated this, nor have I really organized my life for most of my life, and I'm over 50 now, in a way that I valued this. And then I had a health event a year ago in August where I had 2 bleeding vocal cords, and I needed to take 3 weeks after my surgery in complete silence to recover. And it wasn't until then that I really started to understand that when people have a health event that's due to stress, as mine was, some of us won't recover from that. It will be a heart attack or cancer that kills us. So I felt very lucky that I had a wake-up call that gave me the opportunity to shift things up for myself. But it shouldn't take a health event in your life to finally wake up and say, I am going to advocate for myself so that what you're talking about here, Jessica, is possible.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, thank you for sharing all that. And you use lots of great words here. Advocate for yourself. We're going to circle back to that one. Systems at work, prioritizing. I think I was talking to Kyra before this call about how, and I've been very honest on the Thursday webinars this year. Our goal this year is to really teach people about integration across the life course. And I have had a year where my life has been out of balance because we've been dealing with growth, and that's a good thing. But when I was talking to Kyra, because I've practiced these skills so much, even during my year of imbalance, I had some really cool techniques I used to kind of keep on track. And so that's the fun part of this, is that once you do start learning these ways to think in a more integrated way and say, look, when I actually set boundaries, my workplace benefits. If it's a win-win boundary, my workplace benefits. I can't do it all. And I actually value team players who are smart that way. I'm much better off as a leader if I have a team member who can say, hey, I actually can't handle all this. Help me prioritize. So this is an ongoing skill set that workplaces benefit from. But something Kyra and I talked about when we talked earlier this week is it's countercultural. Most organizations think you are the better employee if you just work all the time, and just never say no. And so what we're really talking about today is a very countercultural activity. And so the idea that sometimes it means that you have to be the one who advocates for yourself because too many workplaces aren't supportive of this, that might actually be the place we begin. So there's more I could say about this. There might be something else you want to say, Kyra, before I go on to the next slide.
No, that's okay. I'm good.
Okay. Well, what you see in this picture, too, is that we're all these batteries are swimming in a sea of blue. That's something else that's changed since Kyra and I started both of our organizations, is that the amount of work that's coming at us and how quickly it comes at us and how 24/7 it comes at us has changed in the last 20 years too. And so I really, of course, sometimes life spills into work, but really more often work spills into life, and there's some real consequences to that. If you've been on a Thursday webinar before, you've probably seen this slide. We work with an amazing group of leaders who have really been pushing back at this overwork concept and really believe that their organizations work better if they avoid chronic overwork. That's that red line. And the person who really taught me this is this guy, Ben Applegate, and he's the one who said, look, there's going to be periods of time when there's too much work, episodic overwork, but nobody benefits if there's chronic overwork. And so, again, if you think about this group of people who don't set very good boundaries, and there's this constant onslaught of work in this 24/7 world we live in, there's a lot of problems that can happen in these workplaces. And we've, perhaps some people on the call today are even part of workplaces like this. You're in a culture of fire drills. People are exhausted. They feel pulled in multiple directions. Like I started the call, flex means working evenings, weekends, and more. I think most people now think, oh, it's my vacation. I'll just work in a different place. This is not the future I'm advocating for. And I don't think it's actually a future that's really good for any of these workplaces. It's also a future that plays out really strong gender norms, because what happens is, we do have other responsibilities. There is a new baby at home. There is a school-aged child returning from school at 3 o'clock. There is a teenager who, is home for the summer and you want to make sure is doing things that make sense. There are aging parents that need our attention. And so it reinforces really traditional gender norms if we perpetuate this culture of chronic overwork. Kyra, nothing required, but any thoughts about any of those things?
I think it really just comes down to, I laugh Nancy Reagan and her Just Say No campaign. It's not so easy, but it really starts with each one of us just questioning the status quo.
Yeah.
Even if you aren't in a position economically to say no,
yeah,
there is the opportunity to start to recognize whether or not this chronic overwork is a choice. For some of us, it's a choice. For me, I get off on it. That's why it's an addiction for me. I have felt throughout my life a strong sense of self-esteem and pride and identity connected with being really good at churning out work. And it was a shift for me to have to stop and say, to recognize, to come to terms with the fact that that is actually a choice. Nobody is doing that to me. No one's requiring that. It's my choice. And so even, it doesn't mean that we all, quit our jobs and start a revolution necessarily. But what it does invite us to do is to really start to think about, where do you stand on these issues? How do you feel about work? What has your relationship been to achievement? How much of this really is something that you're saying yes to because you kind of like it? And how much of it is that you're saying yes to it because you feel economically trapped or like you don't have a choice? How much of it is because you're actually really unhappy and don't want to live this way, but you haven't really ever thought about the root of it, and maybe just this framing can be beneficial to you. So we're all in a different place on this, and I think it's a matter of just starting to create some consciousness around it.
Yeah, wonderful. And again, really powerful words that you've used. That's kind of what we've tried to do this year on our Thursday webinars, is talk about it. And it's a choice that we have to keep on making. It's not a choice that suddenly, check the box, done making that choice. Woohoo, I can handle this the rest of my life. Instead, I think of it as more like a muscle group around how to kind of get smarter and smarter of assessing what's the right amount of work that I can handle, given what's happening today. For me personally, in my family, at my workplace, it's, those are all constantly shifting. So we're constantly having to adjust. It's just, but but the benefits, if you are someone who wants to live an integrated life, if you're a team that wants to have that better balance, if you're an organization that values that people learning how to set smart boundaries that are good for them and good for the organization actually helps you improve your work, there really are some great answers, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So what I also heard in Kyra's word, and we're not doing this today, but on our other webinars this year, she talked about how there's this kind of ongoing personal, organizational, and cultural forces that can kind of promote us to let work take over our lives. But at each life stage, we can push back at those. There's a real opportunity to do an integrated approach at each life stage. And if you're smart around pushing back at some cultural norms, organizational norms, you're smart around money, you can really do things differently. So today's call is looking at how to do this around managing the right amount of work, but all year long, you can really see that this is something that can be actualized if this is what you're interested in. All right, so Third Path has always looked at this from 4 lenses. I'm going to talk about this very briefly, but really what I want to get to is Kyra's book. Since we were founded, we said there's 4 ways to flex work: when you work, where you work, who does the work, and the 4th one, workflow, how much you work. And honestly, when I first put this, handout out 16 years ago, I don't think people understood the workflow one and how important it was, because I really knew that, even this idea that, who cares what the just measure results, not where people work or when people work. Well, if people set too high a standard of how many results need to get done, people are going to be working too many hours. So all 4 categories are things we need to think about when we're flexing our work. And that 4th one is the one we're talking about today. How do you manage the right amount of work? And interestingly, in Kyra's book, she had, when I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like going into a candy store. There were so many good ideas around how to think about capacity management. There was like pages of it. So I've only put up a handful up here, and we're going to talk about them really briefly. And then we're going to talk really specifically about how she's helped or how we can help individuals, teams, and leaders think about this. And I've actually asked Kyra to talk about an example where she's really had some success helping people think about capacity management. So as you can see in this slide, I've kind of clustered it into a couple of different categories. Her book is written for managers. How can that manager help their team work in a more flexible way? And these are the specific ideas she had around thinking about capacity management. And so we have 3 clusters here. And after I talk about a cluster, I'm going to get Kyra to add a couple of thoughts. The first one is what a manager can do for an employee. And what's interesting is, a lot of these things are things that we do at Third Path. One-on-one meetings to think about, what are you working on? Do you have enough time? Are you clear what your priorities are? Do you have time for your quote-unquote most important work? Boy, oh boy, does everybody at Third Path know about that. We constantly categorize things as 1, 2, and 3 at Third Path. 1 is a top priority. 2 is if I have time, I'm going to get to it. And 3 is when I finish 1 and 2, I'll get to 3. And those shift over time. But that whole idea that working one-on-one with your employees to make sure they're clear about what their most important work is and having time to do that is one thing managers can do, and something we do really all at Third Path. And in challenging your employees if you think they're being unrealistic, and having enough trust that they can tell you if they're feeling overwhelmed. They're not being weak when they're overwhelmed, but they're actually being helpful, because then you can reprioritize. Kyra, any other thoughts about this one or the second cluster of topics? And then we'll look at the third one in a second.
Yeah, so at Life Meets Work, it was a solo endeavor for a couple of years, and then we started hiring people. And so that began the grand experiment of, can we be successful and live this way at the same time? And so I built a culture, or offered up, I should say, a culture where we talked about this. We have a weekly capacity meeting where everybody comes with their priorities, what they're not getting energy from in their work, what they are getting energy from. We reorganize people in their roles so that we can maximize the kinds of work that give people energy, and minimize the kinds of work that don't. And so we set all this up, created a transparent organization, and said, we want to be having these conversations. And after hiring a couple of people, I started to notice that we were being less and less transparent, that there were less and less of these conversations taking place. And so I stopped and spent a little bit of time talking with some of our new hires about this. And 201, they said, we're not used to this. This isn't comfortable for me. And what I learned was that we all have a legacy that our previous employers and even our current employers have left with us. We've learned how to adapt in a culture that may be more or less supportive of this. And so what I learned from that was really important is that as a manager, it's not just you can build it and they'll come. It really requires much more than saying, hey, if you're feeling overwhelmed or your to-do list is too long and you're not sure where to turn next, just come and see me. I said that over and over and over again, and people wouldn't come and see me. And I could sense that these new recruits were getting more and more bogged down. And so I had to reach out and say, let's schedule a meeting tomorrow morning and bring your to-do list and let's just sit down and talk. And what I found was that employees had a lot of shame around their to-do lists and the things that they weren't getting to. And it was hard with a couple of people I did this with specifically for them to say, I'm not sure how to prioritize. I have too much work and I need your help. And so as a leader, I just really needed to be proactive in having that conversation. And then over time, demonstrating that there wasn't a negative consequence to having been that transparent, then they could start to open up and be more comfortable having those conversations with me.
Oh, that is wonderful, and such a good lead-in to the one that I really wanted to highlight, which is, what we can do as leaders to role model this, because I'm going to be putting a premise on the table today, which is I believe, when we get to the end of our webinar, I really want to hear from the audience and see if people don't agree with what I'm about to say. But I actually believe leaders are key to culture change. And if we don't have some leaders who model this approach, this integrated approach, I don't think we're going to ever have an organization really, truly change. I think you can create a pocket of change around a leader who's doing it differently, like that mid-level leader who's doing it differently and has kind of created that flexible team around them. But if senior leadership doesn't really actually model this approach, the signal to the rest of the organization is, you got to put work first and nobody's going to change. And so I really believe when it comes to capacity management, which is at the core of an integrated life, you have to have had leaders model this throughout their careers preferably, and at that moment as well. And so I want to talk a little bit about this because one of the things that you talked about was shame. I think what's interesting, even as a leader, I felt some shame this past year trying to manage it all in a year of growth. And we've really learned as an organization that growth is very hard from a capacity management point of view for a long reason I could talk about. And I felt shame because here I am out in the world trying to teach people work-life integration, and I was having a tough year. And I had to be transparent about that with my team and say, you know what, I'm not feeling really great about this. I don't think I'm doing something wrong. And I actually had one of my team members who was really good at listening to me as I would kind of talk about my priorities, almost weekly and say, okay, there's these 10 things I got to get to, and I feel like I'm only going to get to 5. And somehow not making it taboo to not really feel like I was succeeding, I think is critical, because there's going to be these times, even as leaders, where we don't get it right, and modeling not getting it right maybe actually increases trust too. So there's lots more we could say, but as a leader, role modeling is critical. And I think, Kyra, what you just talked about is that you are really encouraging that kind of conversation in all kinds of ways. Is there anything else you can say as some of these points about leaders role modeling?
I think it's about looking at the team. When I think about how we create incentives in an organization, the kinds of incentives that as employees that are doled out or given out to us as opportunities, they're usually individual or they're at an organizational level. And so when we think about team, a team can be defined in lots of different ways. So I don't mean team by any specific definition. But when we look at the team as a unit, we've got some options that get lost when we look at it at an organizational level, and give some room, some space, and some capacity, some cover even for employees, rather than looking at it at an individual level. And so what I mean is to look at workload for the team overall, and to create incentives around what the team is accomplishing, gives team members then incentive to be helping each other out, to be offering, let's say I have a little bit more capacity this week, rather than hoarding that and maybe leaving early for the benefit of myself. Nothing wrong with that, right? But as a manager, I don't want to see too much of that behavior, because if we look at it as a unit, that individual who has some capacity can be offering up to take something else off of someone who has not enough capacity off of their plate. And so you can start to see more levers that you can pull around managing the capacity of the team. You also start to see team members stepping in to help each other, and also to challenge the priority. And so in our weekly capacity meetings, team members we were openly, there was incentive for us to be challenging each other when we were going through our top priorities for the week. And more subordinate level people would challenge the more senior people. So it wasn't just senior people challenging, people with less quote unquote power, right? And so it flattened out the team in terms of hierarchy, so that everybody could be weighing in and openly questioning, why did we say yes to a client when we knew it was going to create too much work in too short a time? And sometimes those choices were the right choice, and everybody just had to get on the bus.
Yep.
In other cases, it was really important, because it was like, note to self, next time we're going to check with the project manager first about capacity, right? And so that became a norm. And so we just learned through that feedback, but creating that kind of openness and safety and security around that takes some time, because like I said, people don't always come into your team knowing that that's okay.
Yeah. No, interesting. And, I think there's this incredible positive reinforcing loop between having some real priorities outside of work that helps us get smarter about this. I was just talking to a leader yesterday who was, giving a very concrete example of what Kyra was talking about. He noticed that once again, his team was working late on Christmas Eve day, because there's some projects that kind of come in at the end of the year. And he said, this is crazy. What can we do next year so this never happens again? And it meant sitting down with the customers, sitting down with the team, coming up with a new way of starting things much earlier in December. And from then on, many, many years from then on, they didn't have that problem of kind of really all having to stay late on Christmas Eve day. So yes, there's some real opportunities here when we can get smart with our teams and have some good conversations with our customers. So great. Well, that's exactly where we want to go next. We want to talk a little bit about, there's many different directions we could go in, but we decided we'd kind of focus on priority setting. And I was going to kind of get Kyra to think with us about, well, how has she learned that helps people set priorities as individuals, teams, and leaders? And one of them, we've already talked about, there's kind of open communication as a team, incentivizing team members to be able to speak up and help find efficiencies. What are some other thoughts that you learned around helping individuals, teams, and leaders set priorities, since that's such a basic part of boundary setting and collective boundary setting and capacity management?
I strongly believe we have to start with the fact that constraints actually exist.
Yep.
And that might seem funny, but a lot of us won't recognize at any one of these levels that there are actually constraints. So there are 4 hours in a day. I have to remember how many hours are in a day. And then I have to multiply that times 7 in a week times 365 days. There's my capacity. It actually doesn't work that way. So if we start with a basic math problem, how many people do you have? How many hours are they expected to work? Like legitimately, like in your employee manual, expected to work.
Yep.
And then how much work, how many hours worth of work do you have? And where is the gap? And that's where then, if we're honest about, we have to subtract out vacations, we have to subtract out evening and weekends, then we get to how we used to 25, 30 years ago define our work capacity.
Yeah.
So maybe that's like me saying, if you're on average getting 4 hours of sleep a night, and now I say you're really supposed to be getting between 7 and 8. So next week, just start getting between 7 and 8 hours of sleep a night. You're going to tell me I'm absolutely crazy. You can't shift your work and your priorities in that way, right? But if I suggest that you add 15 minutes worth of sleep every night over the next month, and then add another 15, it's much easier. So I'm not suggesting that you take all of the work you have and the day after tomorrow decide, I'm going to constrain that to 38.5 hours in the week, or 40 hours in the week, or 50 hours in the week. But the idea is to start there and to look at how big your gap is, and then start to ratchet it back over some realistic period of time. So we have constraints. The other thing is that even when you look at the hours you actually have, you will never get 100% capacity for that more constrained amount of time. You won't. And I learned this the hard way as a leader, because I'm like, okay, well, I calculated out all these things, so why can't we get this much work done? It's because we're all human beings, and on any given day, Jessica, you've got a cold, you're not going to be working at 100%.
Yep.
And you're not a robot, and you're not a machine, and we don't want to create that kind of a workplace. So then you've got to scale back the number of hours even more to maybe 90% or 85% or 80% or 75%, which is far more realistic. So now you might be having a heart attack because you're like, there isn't any time within which we can get anything done. But that's the point. So recognizing that we have constraints actually breeds productivity, it breeds creativity, and it breeds innovation. And there have been all kinds of studies that have been done to show that when we recognize our constraints at a team level or at an individual level, now we get really super creative and really smart, because now it's like, okay, well, how can we, within these constraints, actually do what it is that we need to do? So one place you want to look is processes. Where are the inefficiencies in the system? And many of us don't even have time to look at the inefficiencies in the system, so we just keep doing the same thing all the time. So I encourage teams to create efficiency task forces, and on once a month or once a quarter, whatever you think could be realistic, have everybody on your team or have sub-teams identify what is one thing we could do, we could eliminate or we could make more efficient. How much time is that going to save times the number of people? And before long, you're starting to work within the constraints that you have, because you've sort of gotten rid of the inefficiency. Another key thing that managers can have a really difficult time with is this idea of managing up. So middle managers are middle managers because they're stuck in the middle between employees who have constraints that we may or may not want to recognize, and leaders who are setting the ultimate priorities for the organization. And so it's why middle management is so incredibly difficult. It's where the vast majority of people play in your organization. And so what is required is not only to honor and recognize the constraints of the people below you, but then to communicate, or on your team, but then to communicate those constraints upward. And that's very frequently where we don't have a lot of courage. So it's another place that you can look. Am I being honest and open and communicative and transparent with my leaders about our constraints? Now, for some people, that feels like that's going to be a career-limiting move. And so that's where I go back to thinking about having you think about, Are you being honest with yourself about how happy, how engaged, and how productive you are? What are the things that you need to have for you, and what are the things that your team needs to have for them in order to feel engaged and happy and productive and integrated, balanced, whatever words you want to use? And then what is it going to take to get there? And so when we really have courage to be transparent, either to our leaders as an individual contributor, to our more senior leaders as a middle management executive, once we start to become more honest, now we've got to own the consequences of that honesty and that transparency. And some of us don't want to do that because we're afraid we're going to have to reckon with what we intuitively already know about our organization, that they don't care, that it isn't a priority, that it's all about profitability and performance, and there isn't going to be any wiggle room. Now, if we're coming to those conclusions, which ultimately means I have a choice of either being unhappy and staying in the organization or leaving, which for some of us may or may not feel as possible, then what we may be having a relationship with our organization in our own head. We're having that hypothetical conversation without actually giving our leaders an opportunity to hear us and to respond in a way maybe that we didn't expect. So that's where, when I'm working with managers, and I do a lot of training in this space, a lot of times there will be that moment at about 2:30 in the afternoon in a full day workshop where there will be a couple managers who say, oh, I haven't been doing that. I haven't been managing up. I haven't been conveying our constraints because I've been afraid. And that's the action I'm going to take back with me.
Yeah.
Because it may or may not be what it is that you think. One quick example, I had a conversation with my accountant this morning, and I needed, like, I sound like a 3-year-old pounding my fist on the table. I needed to meet with him before the end of the week. And he said, I can't meet with you. And I said, but Doug, I told you last week I needed to meet with you. And he said, I can't meet with you. And I said, all right, well, then it's going to have to be Monday at noon. And he said, okay. And the entire time we're having this conversation, I knew that I was not going to push him harder so that he had to do work in the evening or the weekend in order to meet my, fist pounding on the table, right? And so compromised with him for noon on Monday, even though I wanted this issue resolved before the weekend because it was going to make me feel better psychologically. I said yes to noon. And I said yes to noon so that I could honor his need for an integrated life. Yep. That hasn't always been the case with accountants. A lot of times they've been bred to be like, okay, yes, I'll talk to you at 10 o'clock at night or 5 o'clock in the morning because you're a client. And so it's important that we support not only this behavior for ourselves and our teams, but for our providers, our vendors, our suppliers.
Yeah. Wow. Great. Yeah, that's great. So the way that we can kind of model this goes way beyond just ourselves and our organizations. That's great. I want to underscore 2 things that you said that are awesome. And boy, the time is zipping by. So we're going to keep one eye on the clock too. One really tangible thing we can all walk away with. There's many great points Kyra made. Is that there is there's in many organizations there's a seasonality to work. There is a busier period and a less busy period. Third Path notoriously has a slower and very intentionally has a slower summer month. So that's when we do a lot of our slow down and say, hey, what worked, what didn't work, what inefficiencies happened last year that maybe we can address and do differently, set them up over the summer when things are quieter so we start our new programming year in a smarter way. And I think taking advantage of the seasonality of work and using the slower periods to actually look at inefficiencies and address them is a really big opportunity of one of the things that Kyra was talking about. I'm going to put one more picture up to talk about this middle manager because I think she's really onto something. So this is an attempt to show why leaders are so critical to change, but why it's so hard for leaders to make change too. But this whole idea of managing up that Kyra was talking about is so powerful. And I'm actually even going to give you a very concrete example of a leader I worked with who works in a large manufacturing organization, and she was promoted to take over a team that was actually kind of chronically overworked. And what's interesting is she did exactly what Kyra talked about. she said, you know what, I'm a believer in work-life integration, and I've inherited this team where people are pretty unhappy. They're all kind of overwhelmed, red or yellow, very few people feeling like they've got the right amount of work, mostly feeling like they've got too much work. And what she did was she said, okay, team, I need your help. We need to keep track of what we're working on, what's really using up all of our time. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk to this guy. And I'm going to say, hey, here's what's eating up all of our time. Help me prioritize this work. Because basically right now, everybody's got their foot to the floor and they just cannot handle all this. So we've got to figure out which of these things is less important and which is more important so that I can make sure that I don't burn them out and that we get the most important work done. Think about that. What a cool thing. She got her team to really help work with her around documenting what they're working on so she could have that managing up conversation. And it was all about what's good for the bottom line. So leaders can become this incredible vehicle for making change. But I hope what this picture shows you, and we're going to talk more about it in a second, is that it's pretty hard to be a leader and model this too. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that next. Kyra, any other thoughts you want to talk about priority setting, what individuals, teams, and leaders can do, or this picture before I talk one more thought?
Yeah, I notice, especially in this one particular client of ours, that the managers who are doing this well are managers who've either had a health event, and I've got one manager that I'm visualizing in particular right now, or who have come recently from outside the organization. And there's something about those two circumstances that make it much easier for people to truth tell. And through them sharing how they just speak very openly and don't get nervous about these transparent conversations, not only with their leaders, but with their peers, that others in the organization, when they hear or pay attention or get clarity on the fact that these leaders are doing that, it means that they can draft behind them. It means that they're not being as countercultural as it might feel like they are, because these other leaders are quote unquote getting away with it. They're not getting fired. They're actually being respected. They're getting resources that teams where the leader is more reticent to share that aren't. And so if this feels really kind of courageous or outside of your comfort zone, look for leaders that are doing this and look at how they have been, the kind of response they're getting. And in this one organization, they're the ones who end up with better resources and better results. So it may not be actually as countercultural as it can feel, and finding those other leaders, building connections and networks with them so that you're all supporting each other can make a really big difference in getting comfortable with this what can feel countercultural in its approach.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, that's where we're going to go next, is to try to say, okay, how do we take some steps that feel like they're not too overwhelming, to put some of these ideas into action. And that's where we're going to kind of go next and wrap up the call, hopefully with what you guys are really learning, which is none of this is because we're just trying to be nice people. Where we're going is showing you that this is better for organizations when we do this. You might work in an organization that really doesn't support these ideas, and as Kyra said, maybe when you get more involved with these ideas and try to learn more about win-win boundary setting, you learn, oh, this isn't the place for me. But more likely, what I'm about to talk about is something that you can do, and you can put into action today. So what this picture is also trying to show you is that 16 years of work at Third Path Institute, and I'm sure Kyra's seen the same thing, we've really learned that there's 2 leverage points for change that you can take action on right now, no matter which organization you're in. And you could be this person who's, feeling a little overwhelmed. And one of the things that we've seen is, figuring out how to have that conversation with your team leader where you can say, hey, I want to do my best job possible, but I feel like all 5 of these tasks are overwhelming, that I can't do my best job on all 5 of these tasks. How could we change things so that I prioritize these and I know which ones are the most important ones to work on? So a person inside of a team can actually talk to a leader on a one-on-one conversation, and that might really start a great dialogue that actually brings even more change around. But if you're a team leader, there's two ways you can make change too. One we've really learned is who your partnership, and obviously this happens for you as an individual. You have maybe a partner outside of you're engaged with, but who your partner is at home can really help you, because I think that truth-telling concept that Kyra talked about, finding places where you can do truth-telling about what things are really like will help you keep your priorities straight. Jeff and I would have a date night on Friday night, and we could talk really about how our weeks had been. And if it felt like things were still continuing to be overwhelming week after week, it became a place for me to kind of really rethink, how do I want to make some changes? What needs to happen? In fact, I've set up quite a few people in my life who I could do truth-telling with on a regular basis, so I can keep perspective. Am I really living the life I want? So just finding people in your life to kind of talk honestly. How are things going? Are you really living the life you want? Will help you get more clear about what kind of change you might want to make. But there's another area that I've really seen our leaders do. They don't have to take on the whole organization. Yes, I want organizations to change, but I've also learned that leaders can actually make a change as a pocket of change. They can build a team up around them that really is smart around priority setting, and then they can manage the boundaries outside of them so that they can protect that team to really feel like they're having better work-life integration as a whole. And I'm going to show you a picture that kind of tries to get at this. So the idea is that you are managing your work-life integration at any point in time, but everybody else's skill also impacts you, and the culture of the organization you're in impacts you. But if you build up that team, because you are that courageous team member who spoke up, you are that courageous leader who's better at setting boundaries around the whole team that you're working with, you can create this pocket of change inside your organization. And back to what Kyra said, I think a lot of it has to do with really kind of creating safety, not feeling shame. All of us can't get everything done, but we can make sure we focus on the most priority work. And finding place to really pay attention. Are we being honest with ourselves about, is this the way we want to live our lives? And then trying to figure out how to make some adjustments to better reach for those goals. What do you think about that? I'm going to put one more slide up, and then we're almost at our end. Any thoughts, last thoughts you have around these ideas of how a team leader can make some change, how a person can speak to a team leader, and that important thing of truth-telling? Any other thoughts, Kyra?
When we get people together to talk about these things, one of the most important conclusions that comes out of it for participants is to say, I'm not alone.
Yeah.
As it turns out, everybody's going through this. I met a couple of men the other night at a hotel. We all just sort of ended up sitting near each other, and they were three young men, and they said, it took us about 45 minutes, but we just figured out we're all leading the same conflict in our lives.
Yeah.
And we just never felt like we could talk about it. So I think really just removing the stigma from the challenges of this so that we can be talking openly can make a big difference both in our personal and our work lives.
Yeah. And we get it. You might be in an organization where truth-telling is not going to be so easy in some pockets. But finding that one person, even if it's a person outside your organization, to help you start getting clear yourself about what is important, then hopefully it won't take a health issue for you to make some change. It'll just you proactively saying, hey, I want to lead a life where I have time for work, do a great job at work, time for my life, time to recharge. In fact, that's our vision, that we really get a world where everybody's smarter around this. And it turns out when we do this, there's just all kinds of benefits. People can stay focused on their most important work. Oh my gosh, this concept we teach people, you can actually start creating routine quiet time where you can focus on your work better. You come back recharged when you get away from work. You can make use of those slower periods to reprioritize or put efficiencies into place. When we all get smarter about this, there's just so many ways we can improve how we get our work done. So we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered the idea that capacity management Learning how to set win-win boundaries is at the core of work-life integration. I hope what you've heard is that Kyra's book, Who Works Where and Who Cares, goes into many other important tools around how to think in a flexible way and create flexible teams. What are some last ideas you want to share with the group, Kyra, on all the different things we've been talking about? Thanks again. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, two things really quick. One is this summer I started managing my to-do list less around P1s and P's and 3s than the old Franklin Covey approach to time management, and started using my intuition. I started looking at my to-do list every day, and having created more quiet, I could tap more into my intuition. And I just started playing with that idea, and it's been 6 months now. And what I have found is I'm no longer a slave to my to-do list. It helps me keep track so that I'm not letting something slip through the cracks or forgetting about it as I age. But to look at my to-do list and say, what do I feel like I want to work on? What do I have energy for? What is intuitively going to deliver the most value for the people I'm working with today? And it's fascinating how it works out a whole heck of a lot better than me feeling like I'm a slave to it. The other thing is that I would encourage anyone who's interested in being a truth teller and having those difficult conversations to do a little bit of digging into how do you have that difficult conversation so that it isn't emotionally based, but that you can be sharing your perspective. The model that I really believe in is the situation impact behavior model. You could Google S as in Sam, I, B as a boy, and that can help, I think, as we build our skill around having those kinds of objective, difficult conversations. It feels like the personal stakes aren't as high, and it's a great model for difficult conversations, both in your personal and in your work life. So.
Wow, what great wisdom. And again, I love that. I think it's funny when you hear somebody say something, you're like, wow, okay, that's probably what I'm doing. Because when I've noticed with myself, when I've had to have a difficult conversation with somebody, I'll often call up somebody completely different and say, okay, I'm giving myself permission to say it all the wrong ways right now. But then when I get on the call with a person or whoever I need to talk to, you're more able to kind of in a relaxed way say, here's why this is good for the business to do this. And we need to really focus on, this, I'm not asking you to make a change just randomly. This is something we all need to do because it's so smart for our organization. So that's very cool. I love that. Hey, this has been just what I hoped. I hope everybody else will stay tuned. We will have a minute or two that we can ask Kyra some questions if you have some questions for her. And we do make all of our webinars available on iTunes so that you can listen in at some future time to the ones that are coming up as we continue a year of looking at courageous conversations, truth-telling conversations around integration across the life course. Thank you so much, Kyra. It was really wonderful. Stick around. We're going to ask her some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
Great.